All right. So for the second half, I just wanted to start off with a brief series of slides. And so I was hoping to kind of start off the conversation with a short presentation from myself. And this will just go over, my experience and what I've seen throughout the web fiction industry and its development. So let me just share the screen. And if you guys could confirm that you guys are seeing this.
Yeah, it works.
Perfect.
All right. Okay. So 10 slides. So just general background, as we all know, web fictions are increasingly mainstream and profitable. In part, so this is an adaptation of the slides presentation I gave to somebody else. So, but obviously they're mainstream and profitable thanks to Royal Road, Patreon, Amazon Kindle, and Audible. But they're also successful because of increasing number of adaptations into things like webcomics, animations especially in the East, like Korea, Japan, and China. And again, they've been adapted into live action films and of course audiobooks. Web fictions they're so successful in the internet age because of comparative advantages to the traditional, from my understanding, compared to traditional publishing, like the non-cost of distribution doesn't cost us a whole lot to, write and then put it out on the internet. It also removes a lot of the gatekeepers because it's direct to readers. So the narrative has kind of flipped, and where publishers are now reaching out to authors first in a lot of the cases. And of course, the ease of putting, editing lifetime, like people do rewrites and they're able to implement those really easily. So this presentation will just cover some of the aspects of, my experience of the web fictions industry and history and development. So some major origins or trends in web fiction can be largely traced back to four major cultural spheres. Japan, Korea, and China have extremely prolific web fiction industries, and they have a very unique flavor of subgenres. So in Japan, I believe this is a subgenre that Douglas is using in My Big Goblin Space Program, isekai, reincarnation into another world. And these subtropes are often inspired by European aesthetics because manga had a big influence from the European aesthetics side. Korea used to be, very much influenced from Chinese martial arts. They've now evolved into more modern post-apocalyptic settings like raiders and hunters. I don't know if you've heard some of these terms, and they've actually been on the forefront of a lot of lit RPG elements. Chinese subtropes are really interesting because we've essentially localized them wholesale, in the sense that, we see a lot of traditional Chinese mythology concepts being written almost as is for the Western audience. So there's a lot of Chinese flavored very strongly Chinese flavored stories, as opposed to Japan and Korea. We don't really see that a lot in the Western market. And in the West, there's also been a very original organic growth of lit RPG and the superheroes genre. Some classics being Warm by Wildbow, which started in 2011, and they've all been influencing each other. But, as this last, and this might be because I am Korean and I do read a lot of Korean media, but, the Eastern genres seem to be seeping into the Western for sure. I'm going to be mindful of the time. My plan was to spend a minute on each slide, and I am already 3-4 minutes in. Okay, so another advantage I think of web fictions is that they provide a template of sorts of a shared world building, shared character archetypes. So, because as the market, lit RPG market and readers and demographics, they consume classics one after the other, and they're hungry for more. So these readers are already familiar with things like leveling systems, species like cat girls, maybe the unfortunate character archetype of cat girls. I don't know. I'm not going to step on anybody's toes. Whatever floats your boat. And it's similar to how fans of things like Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons will instantly recognize orcs, elves, and dwarves. And I think this makes for an interesting storytelling tool because it gives you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can kind of use it in interesting ways by putting different things together, like kind of like Tom was saying he does for certain characters, like interesting character combinations, like a gentle orc chef, or maybe like a super powerful slime. And these are examples that I've pulled from actually, successful stories that exist. So there's a Japanese manga about a very powerful slime. The evolution of web novels has been really interesting to see. On the left, we have Legendary Moonlight Sculptor, which was a Korean web fiction that actually ended up birthing RoyalRoad.com as RoyalRoad.com first started to host English translations of this Korean web novel. It's a very early VR MMORPG story. So this trend has died out in the West, but authors and readers preferring more high stakes actual reincarnation stories as opposed to people entering into like a virtual reality world and developing characters. And on the right, we have solo leveling, which is pretty much a global phenomenon, generated millions for sure, if not close to a billion in various formats, from web fiction to web comics to animations that's coming out or maybe has already come out, and a video game. So if you go to Korea, you see like ads for this on the train stations, on billboards, on buildings. And this jump in quality and this evolution has been in part, thanks to massive and motivated creator communities on monetized platforms. And these platforms are extremely competitive, as you know. I'm just using a very Asian example here, but massive turnover of titles on popular traffic-heavy platforms result in natural selection and evolution of trends. And in the Korean, web novel market, we've seen a lot of consolidation. Oh, this is like a year ago, so that says 2023. But we've seen a lot of consolidation of platforms. So 2008, there was a novel that first introduced like the monetization model, and they did so really successfully. And because it was making a lot of money, there are a lot of other platforms that popped up, including the West. But the interesting thing being, the two giant Korean companies, Naver and Kakao, have actually ended up acquiring even some of the Western web fiction platforms like Wattpad and Radish. And they're making plays for the Western market, whether we'll see how that goes. But why is RoyalRoad.com important? I believe this was a conversation I was having with Ryan. You can't beat free. Free is really hard to beat. Royal Road is important because it hasn't been monetized. It hasn't been put behind a paywall. Whereas a lot of these web fiction platforms have been acquired by big corporations, and they were either already monetized or they became monetized, like Wuxia World, which was acquired by which is a Chinese web fiction platform that ended up hosting a lot of Korean translations, and they became a subscription service. Yeah, but Royal Road has a lot of interesting characteristics that make it a good platform for authors to kickstart their careers or, build an audience. And, dozens of authors, as we know, make six-figure revenues on Patreon alone. Well, actually, I don't know if it's actually five figures. I don't know if it's, but I'm sure, but many of them have become millionaires, is the point. And to kind of, it's a very exciting industry. Of course, there are still some limitations that some of which we have discussed, and these are some of the limitations, in my view, of web fictions. And as a lover of the genre, as somebody who's been reading for 10 plus years, there are repetitive power leveling arcs. Unfortunately, the plot can meander, meaning, like Chris was saying, because they make money, a lot of mangas or animes suffer from this too, where there's a lot of filler episodes. Stories don't end when they should. And and this is less so for more experienced authors, but when authors start out, they end up making it an excessive self-insert fantasy. Now, I'm not, this used to be my view on the limitations. Now I want to definitely tell people to take it with a grain of salt. And I think that's the end of the slides, by the way. But just to kind of wrap it up, I do think that people who write what I would have once called excessive self-insert fantasies, they are extremely successful, right? And this speaks to the time, like, so in Japan, for example, and Korea, where societies are really oppressive and power, wealth inequalities, it's not great here in the US, but it's also really bad in Korea. So that might result in some of these self-insert fantasies featuring dickheads, or just like people who are always trying to angle for their own benefit, or maybe like a lot of opening scenes from web fictions involve like Korean web fictions involve like taking revenge on bullies or like your workplace superiors, things like that. But so as far as limitations go, I don't want to use my own thoughts of what are strengths and limitations or what's bad about web fictions, because it's the people that determine, what they want. And although in some cases they don't know what they want. So anyways, that's just been kind of my take on web fictions and kind of, the history of web fictions. And we've seen a lot of like, Royal Road was not as big as it was. I mean, it was big, but the authors weren't as making as much money in order to, support themselves and find financial success just as little as, 3 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago. Yeah. But since then, we've seen a lot of influx of like Western authors that, I think is great. I think it's good because it raises the quality of writing. But I think if I were to put one thing out there, it's like, the balance between writing traditional novels and for the traditional Western market and this new lit RPG market, is something that might be helped if study these other spheres of web fiction origins and cultures that influence our current market. It's so cool. I'm shivering right now. I have the heater on, but I'm not, I am nervous, but I'm also shivering because it's cold. But yes, that has been my take. And I guess I do have some questions for you guys, but, just to kind of open up the floor, just if you guys have any counter arguments, which I'm very open to. This has just again been my semi-corporate, I've worked for various Korean companies, take on web fictions, but I would love to hear from you guys as well. Yeah. Uh,
I do kind of think that, for example, there are some stories where, as you say, they kind of meander and they don't know where they're going. I think it kind of depends on where the author is taking the story. Like, for example, if you look at someone like Super Supportive, it's basically like the whole premise is that the narrative is meandering and it's very slice of life. And, that guy's, enormous. He doesn't even have to publish his book to make a living off of writing it, which is really interesting because I think probably most of us, from what I could understand, come from, the background of like writing quote unquote like normal books. So we kind of probably just view Royal Road as more like a stepping stone because it's really, really powerful for building an audience. But I think probably all of us, especially because we're also in an agency, we probably view publication as like the end goal. But I think with web novel sites, it's kind of become possible to just keep writing forever. Obviously, when those people then try to publish their books, they face the problem of like, okay, well, this isn't really a book. How do we cut it into pieces? Which is something I've read quite a lot of books, where it's like, okay, it just ended. That was book one, I guess, But I think it's possible to like you can kind of ignore Amazon. I don't think you should because I think Patreon is very. I don't like Patreon.
Volatile and
uh,
they take a significant cut, right?
yeah, they take quite a lot of. Well, I guess Amazon does as well. Amazon takes 30%, but I just think Amazon opens a lot more doors. Yeah.
I'm curious, kind of jumping a little off what you were saying about people writing for the web fiction world versus writing for Amazon, and then also versus using the web fiction world as a stepping stone, where maybe you're telling yourself, I'm writing this for Amazon, but it's currently a web fiction. And then to go back to Ed, do you feel like you're, because the background's interesting to me. I didn't know pretty much any of that. Do you feel like that knowledge would benefit someone more who's trying to write web fiction only? Or do you think that also bleeds into the Amazon readers? Or is it both?
So I think it's a little bit of both. I think it
Mhm.
would greatly, benefit web fiction writers to know this stuff. But, I mean, maybe not greatly, but it's interesting, context. But as for actually the Amazon audience, I think that these successful web novel publishers have built a voracious lit RPG market. So I think you don't you could eat like this stuff is heavily, influenced, it's my perspective as a Korean, amateur translator. That was my foot in the door. But I would say it's slightly a different market for the current Amazon lit RPG market. That has been influenced by Western lit RPG trends.
I
So
mean,
I would say the Amazon is somewhere in between right now. Yeah, so it's like, so Reddit, for example, had a early influence on the web fiction market. I think Mother of Learning started on fictionpress.com and it was publishing once a month. A lot of these big initial web novels had their own blogs that were racking in like 30K monthly unique viewers. And they're not on Royal Road. They weren't on Royal Road until, this phenomenon of Patreon becoming really profitable for them ended up attracting a lot of readers. So I think,
I will say though, I think if you compare Amazon and Royal Road, it's kind of like comparing um, like I think Royal Road is very similar to how Japanese manga are at the moment, where they're taking, for example, late RPG, then they're going niche, and then a niche of a niche, and then a niche of a niche, and so on. And it
right.
becomes like very, very incoherent unless you're like really deep into the overall niche. And I think Amazon is still in a stage where like you can do a traditional isekai story or something that probably on Royal Road would be seen as like stereotypical or like kind of like old school. But on Amazon, it still works because I think there's still a lot of readers still coming into it. I think that's why like Acerith is doing really well. Obviously, Primal Hunter, all these things that have like a very, very if you look at it from like Royal Road perspective, is very, very traditional like beginning where on Royal Road, like you see some really, really crazy spins because people are so into the genres already. Um, so I think probably that's one of the problems that might also exist if you're trying to take a web novel from Royal Road to Amazon, because sometimes some of the stories they don't have an audience there yet because they're still kind of new, even
Mhm.
if as Ed says, like they're very, very voracious readers.
Right.
And like for example, I think I forget who said it, but like Audible, like the market share for lit RPG is like really, really high, like 50, 60%, which is insane, if you compare it to like in terms of volume to like romance or military action or something like that. So there's a lot of readers. I just think like probably, web novel sites, they get a little bit too niche and specific.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think we see that's one reason why we see sometimes stories from Royal Road that don't do so well on Royal Road end up doing really well on Amazon. Yeah, so, you know, yeah,
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
right.
I mean, the hardest thing in the entire world in the publishing industry is figuring out how to promote That's the hardest thing. And all of the big print houses don't have any idea. They don't know what they're doing. Their sales are dropping. They're shaving authors, and their investors are telling them all we want is IPs that we can turn into movies. And so they're neglecting their stable of like B and C and D list authors, trying to chase these A list authors. And then there's a whole political angle about what kind of stories they're looking for and who they want to have writing them. But the thing with Amazon is that it kind of sidesteps that whole industry. Amazon Kindle Unlimited is the world's largest bookstore, the single largest book outlet in the entire world. And so the trick with that is like, how do I get into that with something like, how do I get noticed in that giant ocean of books? And that's where Royal Road can come in, right? If you're writing a kind of story that Royal Road readers will like, then when it goes live on Amazon, some of them are going to buy it, and then you're going to start off with some sales, and then you're going to get some of the algorithm recommendation stuff, and you might actually do really well there.
I also think like Royal Road compared to maybe other sites like Scribble Hub or Wattpad, I feel like Royal Road has like very, very dedicated readers. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a really, really good site for launching lit RPG, for example.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I
well, I
just want
think
to
how
add
big it
on
is.
to what Ryan said with publishers and what they're looking for nowadays in terms of promotion. The most attractive thing you can bring to a publisher isn't an amazing book, it's a pre-existing audience. And
Yep.
so it's really on the author to build that before they even get into the traditional publishing side, more so than it ever was in the past.
Well, I mean, like, think about it. Like, so, we're largely in fantasy. Um, Everybody knows who Brandon Sanderson is. Can you think of another fantasy author at a big publishing house right now who is still releasing books? Like any? Can you name one? Most
I
of
mean,
us probably struggle.
who,
And
who
there, and that's just because. So
publishes Sarah J. Maas? Because she's kind of the big fantasy name right now.
there's Larry Correa's doing his Son of the Black Sword series. It's really good. I mean, there's some around, but like if you think about it, like you have to stop and think. Like who is a fantasy author other than Brandon Sanderson and maybe like some smaller guy that I'm aware of that's still publishing right now. And the problem, like, that is 100% the fault of these publishing houses because we're the audience. I'm the guy they want to sell books to. Like I have 1,000 books on my bookshelves over there, and I'm eager for more. And they don't know how to find me.
Mhm.
They don't know where I am. They don't know how to get these books into my hands. Like they just put them in airports and hope I walk by
I
on
think
a.
it goes to what Scott said, that a traditional publisher wants you to bring them an audience. And
Mhm.
to your question about, kind of the death of the popular fantasy author, you can see it maybe with Dungeon Crawler Carl, is that the publishers are now, they're going to where the audience is and finding the people who have found an audience. And so it'll be interesting to see if they start jumping harder and harder on the lit RPG bandwagon and signing authors who over here we have audiences because we're coming from Royal Road and we have Patreon.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But I also
I mean,
like it's kind of like a lit RPG gold rush right now. Like I think last year was like the first time I started hearing about RB Media getting into to lit RPG. They have Tantor and they have quite a lot of other brands, but like that's the biggest audiobook publisher in the world, I think, or at least in the West. And like there's also a lot of other publishers that are coming into lit RPG, and as Ryan is saying, it's probably because they don't really understand how to market to their audience. So instead, they're going out to seek a pre-existing audience, and their main, how do you say, their main motivator is just getting money, I guess. And and they're going where the money is. Like they see like, oh, Audible has an enormous market share for this genre we have no clue about, and they see where all the authors are coming from, and that's why they're like seeking them out.
Yep.
Because like even I don't know if it's nice to call him a small author, but like I know someone who had like 500 followers on on Royal Road, which is not considered huge, but he got like a really, really good deal or a really good offer
Hmm.
from like a really, really respectable publisher. And it's like, I think a lot of them they're targeting the stories they think will do well in the future, kind of like a investment. Yeah, I think it's interesting. There's a lot of money coming into the space.
Who was the publisher?
It was Tantor, I believe. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
audio publisher.
That's
If
kind of what Podium did. They found me fairly
Yeah.
early on.
Well, if it's anything like in the self-published romance world, it's kind of interesting. You'll see people who are independently very successful, like top 10, top 50 all the time. And then they'll randomly have a book with a traditional publisher. And it becomes kind of this symbiotic thing where the self-published author, they say, sure, I'll give you a book and you can leverage my audience and I'll leverage yours. And then we'll hopefully both kind of come out of this beneficially in the end. So I'll be curious. I think it's different in lit RPG because people aren't churning out a new book every month. Like we're trying to do these big long series. But it's a tough choice as an author if you feel independently successful and then a publisher comes along and offers to work with you. You have to ask yourself, are they going to do better with this than I would, first of all? And then, is this beneficial to me? Is this beneficial to the book? And it's not always an easy choice, but it probably, I think it'll be coming more and more to lit RPG, which will be like once Dungeon Crawler Carl kind of fleshes out, maybe there'll be a similar thing. Like there was a big rush for audiobook acquisition, I think. And then I was told they overdid it and they were giving people these massive advances wherever they could. And then it kind of bit them in the butt. But maybe that'll happen again with just the ebook rights for, publishers coming after us.
So I've been following traditional science fiction and fantasy for a long time. So it's not hard for me to just start thinking about a list of fantasy authors I know of who are still in the game, who are traditionally published. But the thing that stands out to me is that most of the ones that I can think of, they usually started at least 20 years ago with the traditional publishers. And in a number of cases, they are veering off to do things themselves. And they are starting to do, so you have, 20 years ago, it would have been unimaginable for an author who'd gotten their foot in the door with one of the big five to go.
Yeah, Michael J. Sullivan's on Royal Road now.
Yeah, I was gonna
Yeah,
say.
people will start self-publishing, even though they, by traditional terms, made it with a big five publisher, just because a lot of what's out there is changing very rapidly. And if you have the audience, it can make sense to go alone rather than go with a publisher who has no idea how to cope with the current market.
And the large publishers are also notoriously slow to adapt to changes in the industry as well.
Yeah, I got friends in traditional publishing. Some of them pretty successful. And the rule in traditional publishing has always been don't chase trends. Don't do it. Write the story you want to write. Ignore what's popular, because by the time it gets to print, the trend will be gone. And that is not true on Royal Road.
Mm-hmm.
That is not true at all.
Right.
I mean, obviously you have to write something that you like and that you're excited about.
Yeah.
But my little brother, he's like, okay, I'm going to take every single trope of isekai and I'm going to literally call the story bog standard isekai. And, that is 100% trend chasing. And he'll admit it if you ask him. He says, and he's doing really well. I mean, it's a whole different world.
I think the only trend that has kind of like died out, as Ed mentioned earlier, was the VR trend. Like it used to be really, really huge, but I feel like it capped out really, really quickly. Like as soon as something like Sword Art Online came out as an anime, the whole genre was already basically oversaturated. And I feel maybe it's because the genre itself was maybe too limiting, because you're in a game and it's like, okay, well, how do we add the element that actually makes it interesting. And it's always it's a
Right,
death
we had
game.
stakes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where layer RPG is so fantastic because like you can probably name like 20 different isekai and you can say like they're all traditional, they're all bog standard, but they all still do things differently enough. Like even the minutia of their systems are different enough that like people will find something interesting between the various series. Like I watch quite a lot of anime, and I think I watched anything that has the isekai tag. I mean, there's a lot of really, really terrible ones, but I don't think I've seen two that are like so identical that that you would be like, okay, they're just copying each other. Because even the ones where they copy, they still make enough differences that it's interesting enough to keep watching or reading or whatever.
So has there been like maybe like a web fiction that you guys have like really enjoyed or have been inspired by? Just I guess I'm just quick segue into some of the questions that I've prepared. I don't know if it's a
So,
good one.
sort of the opposite, actually. We just mentioned anime and watching isekai anime. My Goblin Space Program specifically was actually hate-spired by another Goblin Isekai anime that came out this year. I'm not going to name names, but it's not going to be
I
too
know
hard to
which
figure
one.
out.
It's terrible.
Which
It's so
one? Oh,
terrible.
okay, no names, no names. But speaking of Goblin Isekai, I just wanted to mention that the father of the genre from my perspective was this manga called Re Monster. I don't know if it's also the anime, but it's an interesting read and a very classic case of web fiction, like the self-contained monster of the day stories. And literally each chapter is a day, and it just goes on and on. But it, you know,
It's a terrible anime. It's
it's a
really
terrible
terrible.
story. I mean, there is no story. It's a harem building. I mean, again, to each their own. And I've read a couple of good ones, but of harem building. Don't tell my girlfriend. um, but it's an interesting origin or an early example of Goblin Isekai.
I read Dungeon Crawler Carl for the first time about 2 years ago, and I've always been a fantasy reader, never had heard of lit RPG. And there was a guy in one of my romance writing groups who was a lit RPG fan slash writer, and he suggested it to me. And it was probably like the third or fourth one. I'd kind of tried a few, and they were a little more like the traditional Chinese translations. And it's kind of like what Chris was getting into when you're coming from maybe a background of a fantasy reader. There's a lot of implied understanding from a story that's written for a web serial audience. And so I kind of experienced that as a reader, just coming headfirst into this story that expected me to understand a lot of conventions and things that I did.
Right.
So I bounced off a few pretty quickly. And then Crawler Carl got me because it was kind of accessible. And again, like Chris was saying, it's kind of like I guess it's not really standard. It's got some weird stuff, but as far as like the system goes, it's not that hard to understand. It's not like super niche. And so yeah, that one I really enjoyed it, and I kind of haven't found one that I like as much as that since then. So it's probably still my favorite.
I got one bone to pick with something Ed keeps saying. He keeps referring to old Portal fantasies, like old isekai, stuff like that, that's like 10, 15 years old.
Mm.
Do you know when the first story about a magical girl tumbling out of the real world and falling into a magical fantasy realm was?
I want to say Inuyasha. I think Inuyasha was inspired by something else, though. I don't know if that's where you're going at.
Alice in
Alice in
Wonderland,
Wonderland.
Oh my God. Yeah. Oh my God.
1865.
The original
You're right.
RPG.
Point taken. Point
1865.
taken. The
So
Power ups as well.
they've been doing Portal Fantasy. They call it different things over the years, but they've been doing it forever. Just wanted to point that out.
No, that's a great point. Yeah.
I
I
think.
mean, that
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I was just going to go back to the question. Go ahead, Thomas.
that is one of the things that pops out to me a lot is that because there's so much that's changed, it's very easy to lose sight or not know about some of the deeper history items. So, like, this is not the first time that Western fiction has become. I think now it's become mostly serial by volume, probably. Web fiction is really banging out there in terms of volume. Series are everything, the endless series. But serial fiction was also really big back in the late 1800s. And some of the problems that you mentioned with serial fiction, like meandering plot, somebody gets trapped by their own success.
Great
Arthur Conan
expectations.
Doyle with
Right.
Sherlock.
I believe the
Uh,
term was pulp fiction, right? Pulp fiction is.
No, that was different.
Oh, that was different. Okay.
Yeah, no,
yeah, so
it is
there's a
very
huge
cyclical though.
mystery.
Yeah, so they had like Charles Dickens wrote his novels in serial format in newspapers, which is why Great Expectations is so long and just intolerably boring in many parts. But pulp fiction refers to like really cheap printed
Hmm,
material, and that's like 1910s, 1920s kind of thing.
I see.
Is
Dime
when that
store
really got
detective
going.
novels.
Yeah, and it's
Detective novel.
like little novels that nobody. I mean, they were just not respected at all. They were just for fun, just kind of
Hmm.
I go down to the general store and see one kind of like a comic book kind of a thing.
Yeah, I mean,
Are
like
you saying something or are you muted?
who?
Were you saying something? Oh,
No, no, no. I was just gonna say like the thing Thomas was talking about, like for example with Doyle as well. It's like a really, really good example of someone trapped by their own success. Because he like famously hated writing Sherlock Holmes. Like he was way more into his other stories, right?
hmm, interesting. I didn't know that.
Uh,
It's a great
Hated it
book,
so much he
great
tried to kill
series.
the character.
I was
Oh,
just gonna say like to the question you had about like inspiration. Like I know we have some hate inspiration. For me personally, I've always just felt like any kind of concept that really spoke to me was a good inspiration. And sometimes like if I read a story and there's like something in the story that I feel like could be taken to like drawn out into something more, that's always really interesting. Like for example, when I wrote Isekai Exorcist, I was just inspired by the fact that there weren't really any, I feel like, in-depth like Exorcist stories. Like the only one I really know about is like some guy that basically just punches ghosts, which is I think kind of lame. And like there is like games like Phasmophobia that really I thought was really cool because it was very like a very methodical way of like doing exorcisms and stuff like that. That's kind of like what led me to write it the way that I did. And like people have called me out on it. They're like, "This is Phasmophobia in an isekai world." But yeah, I think like it's really interesting how people find their inspiration. So I'd love to go back to the question if we could. Uh,
It's
yeah,
it's kind of a yin and yang. Like, there's great stories that drew me into the genre to begin with, but it's the bad stories that make me say, well, that's not how I would do it. I'm going to do it this way.
I think that's an interesting note that keeps popping up in these like conventions because I think the first year I did this, Inadvisably Compelled, who wrote Paranoid Mage, a very successful series, it's dominated the railroad charts for a while. He said he started out of spite, I can do but like this is, I can do better than that, and I think, in these communities, I think readers become authors, eventually, but it's not an easy thing to do it well. Like, so I can, I want to applaud you guys. I want to applaud you guys because I also started out of spite and I realized, oh, wow, this is really hard to do. Write, maybe in part because I was doing web fiction and the, serializing like on a consistent daily, weekly basis can be challenging because, I come from an academic background, and what we do there is we write a draft, and it's crap, So you go in there with five other people, and you're like, okay, this doesn't make sense. Like, how do we revise this sentence? And you have various roles that you play with other academic writers. So I think, I'm a big fan of rewriting and editing. I wish that I had enough time to read and provide feedback to all of your manuscripts and stuff. And hopefully after this event, I do have some more time to do that. But yeah, it's great discussion. And we have about 10 minutes remaining. So I do have a couple of questions here, but maybe I can open up the floor. Just keep this floor open. Was there anything that you guys wanted to talk about? Questions that you guys might have had for others? And if not, we can talk about things like, I think maybe community. So here's some topics. Maybe we can vote on it, like the digital age, decentralized, the digital age that we live in. So we did inspiration. I mean, we have some business questions like opportunities and red flags, how you guys distinguish genuine opportunities from those that might not be in your best interest. How do you build and maintain a community around your stories? I mean, are there like sub-licensing opportunities other than audiobooks that you guys are interested in or like excited by, like webcomics, movies? I think, we're definitely gonna see movies in the coming years. This trend is just too big and too powerful and the stories are too good, hopefully, not to be adapted into movies. And are there any interesting meta trends in this space that you guys see? And are there any questions out here that you guys are interested in? Yeah, or
I'd be kind of interested to hear people talk about how they manage their discords and just general like philosophy on responding to comments, not responding, how much sort of weight to give that sort of stuff. Just kind of curious for me. That's my vote.
we can also start there, I think.
I was just gonna say like one thing I also would like to talk about is like how people like look at various opportunities, like red flags and stuff like that, like you mentioned. I think that's another interesting topic.
Could you expand on that? Like when you mentioned, how do you, what would you call like a red flag? Like just something that it looks appealing, it's not?
I think this was a reader submitted question, so
Yeah. I think for me, like a red flag would basically be like a deal where people don't really understand what they're signing. Because I've seen that a lot in the various author discords, and people are like, "Oh, I got signed," and then afterwards, people go through the deals they got, and they're like, "Oh, yeah."
Yeah. I could chime in a little bit, not exactly from that perspective because I'm not the best detail oriented, but I've done a little traditional publishing and self-publishing. And I feel like one thing that if you haven't been exposed to both is maybe just not knowing what to ask in terms of what's going to be done. Like you hear it's a traditional publisher, and I think maybe without a little bit of inside knowledge, you can kind of be tempted to treat that as an equal, all-encompassing term. A traditional publisher is going to advertise, put money into my book, reach mailing lists, do promotions. They're going to have like ongoing management of the story and discounted deals and all this sort of stuff. And that's just not true. So I would say maybe a red flag thing to look out for if you started talking to a publisher and it's not something you're familiar with is just maybe find like the biggest publisher and look at it, what it is they do, and then compare that to the one maybe you're talking to. And then also compare it to what you realistically think you could do yourself, because you're ultimately giving them 50, 60% of your book's profit. And, if your book was going to make $100 a day and you're giving your publisher 60%, then you're giving away $60 a day that you could be spending on advertising. And if you don't think that they're going to match that value, then that would, that kind of be my starting point of like, that may be a red flag, but maybe there's a value to you also in not having to do your own advertising and not having to manage all this stuff. And then you can kind of move the sliders around a little bit for yourself and decide if it's worth it.
I think in terms of contracts, the best thing you can do is know people that are already successful in the industry and talk to them, because like you might end up getting screwed. Like you might deserve a much better deal and you would get it from somebody else, but you didn't know that this one publisher likes to have this kind of contract, or that they're lowballing you really hard on royalties because they think that that's like the opening volley, not their final offer. There's a bunch of stuff like that, and there's contract pitfalls that you're going to find with any publisher, because publishing is all kind of one industry. As for where you go and like find these people, I don't know. I got lucky. I'm in Utah. There's a lot of events around here, a lot of fantasy authors in Utah. So you just go and you talk to people, you meet them, you know, attend various functions, things like that, and you can kind of build up a network. I think if I had to do it all online, I'd probably find some of the better people that I know they've been around the block a little bit and maybe join their discords and kind of interact with them there. I don't know, but that's the thing is you don't know what you don't know, and so you got to rely on an expert, and you got to find one. Ed, that's part of his job.
Yeah.
But you know, he's mentioned he's like kind of new to web fiction and publishing and all that stuff, so we got to help him out when we find information he could use. Talk about everything that's going on.
Yeah. I appreciate that very much.
I think like talking about like agency, for example, like before I met Ed, or I guess around the time I met him, I was about to sign like a really, really bad deal, I think, in hindsight. And I think that also kind of to me, like I'm really, really bad at like I think seeking out knowledge like that. But after that experience, I was like, my eyes were like open. I was like, okay, there's actually some really, really terrible deals out there. And, I think a lot of authors might end up in the same position because, especially when it's like Royal Road, it's kind of the Wild West. There's no one holding your hand, there's no one showing you the ropes. And you have to really take your own, how do you say, like, own best self-interest into consideration. But like a lot of people that I've talked to since meeting Ed and since learning how to read through contracts and stuff like that, they're always like like fairly new authors that are like, I just got a deal, I have to sign it, I have to get back to them quickly, because there's like this sense of like fear of missing out. If you don't sign immediately, then you won't get the deal, and if I don't get the deal, it's game over. Even though there's now like I think 20, 30 fairly good publishers in the space. And like I think that's why, like, for example, author discords are really, really huge, especially for Royal Road, because there's just such a wealth of knowledge there. And as Ryan was saying, like seeking out people that know more than you and have knowledge about the various publishers and stuff like that. Like, for example, I knew someone that signed with a publisher that I was speaking to. And after talking to that person, I had like a pretty good idea of what kind of deal to expect. And then I ended up getting an offer that was a lot lower than that. So I figured, okay, there's actually quite a lot of room for negotiations here. But a lot of people won't know that because there's not like a schematic for like, oh, this publisher offers this percentage or this advance or whatever.
Yeah, and if you have a deal, you're contractually obligated not to tell what's in it
Yeah,
in
for the
detail.
most part,
So
yeah.
you have to say things like, it was enough to buy a 2022 Toyota Tercel or something.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of one of the issues, right? Because like the NDAs really make it difficult to learn more about the various publishers.
I think that's by design. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
It's in their interest.
if you're turning down the offer, you're not bound by anything you didn't sign.
Right.
But I think I can, from my nonfiction background, academic fiction has absolutely atrocious publishing deals because people want to publish a book to get tenure. So they're not thinking about the book as a book. They're thinking about the book as an instrument to, I got a book published by a real publisher. Here it is. Give me tenure. And three things that really come up as red flags that I would, this was a reader submitted question. Like I would say the three big red flags. One, Christopher mentioned, if they're putting a lot of time pressure on you to decide right now, publishing moves slowly. If they're trying to squeeze you to make a decision this week, they're up to no good. If the publisher is starting to ask you to pay money to get published, that's a big red flag. And then the third thing, and this became the first thing that I look for in contracts after my experience submitting my book around to various academic publishers. is you look at the term of the contract. So I turned down a contract where they would have rights for the life of the copyright, which is like my death plus 70 years. I didn't want to sign a contract that was going to still be binding on me when I was 90 years old. So yeah, and so you those are my red flags.
Yeah, just to add on to what Christopher and Thomas were talking about, we've talked about publishing deals, but also in the self-publishing space, it's kind of notorious for being rife with some scammers and bad actors that you got to watch out for. But kind of the biggest guiding philosophy I use is looking at a deal: is the company treating you as the product or the customer? Because if you want to make money, then you need them to be treating you as the product, something that will make them money through you rather than make money from you. Especially this is true with a lot of promotional companies who will promise to, send you out to their 30,000 Twitter followers and whatnot. But really, the company is their business model is just taking your money, not making you money, and then taking a portion of that. So with publishers, especially if a publisher asks for any kind of money up front, it's an immediate red flag. Generally, those are vanity publishers to be avoided. But really, like Thomas mentioned, publishing moves slow. So anyone that says, hey, you need to make a decision on this right away, again, red flag.
Thank you for sharing your perspectives, everybody. I'm trying to think of if there's anything high value that I can add to this conversation. I mean, I guess one thing is that, it's a battle of information, right? And putting yourself in other people, in their shoes. And so I think if, it's been a year since I first started working with Ryan, who was my first author client, and I'm very grateful to have been able to work with you and continue to work with you, hopefully. Yeah. And, so I think, negotiations, I started law school. I think I attend night classes, and I think this whole experience has given me a much better, perspective on conflict and negotiation. And conflict doesn't have to be a lose-lose. You can have conflict and have it for ultimately good outcomes for both. So publishers should also want to keep the authors happy, right? And if they end up lowballing you, and you discover that down the line, then you're not going to be happy. So I want everybody, but this is my philosophy. I want to play long-term games with long-term people, long-term thinking people. And if, it might be that, knock on wood, but like maybe I won't be working with some of you in the future, but that's okay because, hopefully like that won't be for a bad reason. Like maybe you guys have better opportunities, and I welcome you guys to take those I would be happy for you guys to take those opportunities. But hopefully I think, like I continue evolving as well. And become somebody who is able to play, support you guys in the long run, and just continue cheering you guys on as a reader too. So on that note, I guess it is 11. I do want to share just a quick gift that I prepared for all of you guys. And this is a little character commission that I like to do for people who attend as panelists each year. So here's all the characters: Apollo from Scott Warren's My Big Goblin Space Program, Bryn from Zach's Level 1 God, Dirt and Socks from the Land of Broken Roads, Lindsay, who couldn't join us today, her story features Max, Nikolai from Accidental War Mage, Tamaru from Isekai Exorcist, and Willow from Waif, Alec by Alec Loans. Yeah, I've read all of these stories. I love them all. That's why I'm happy to be working with you guys. And yeah, thank you so much for joining this conversation today, and I hope that it was fruitful for you guys too, provided some food for thought. Feel free to reach out with any questions, follow-up questions, or things that you guys want to talk about via email, via text. Happy to provide that information for you guys. And I think next year, I want to continue evolving Fictopia in a way that provides value for you guys. I know one idea that Chris had was like a group Discord for the authors. That's pretty easy to implement. I'm just trying to think like if I want to merge that with some of these webcomic artist Fictopia Discord that I have, or if I want to make a new one for you guys. But just things to look forward to potentially. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ed. It was fun.
Yeah,
And
thanks.
gentlemen, nice to meet you all.
Like,
Hey,
Thanks a
you too.
lot. Nice to meet you.
All right. Hopefully you guys have an enjoyable weekend, and you guys don't spend it all cooped up in front of your computers. I know sometimes that happens. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, and much love to all of you guys, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to work with you guys. All right.
Well, my pleasure. Take it easy.
All right.
bye.
Thank you.